Hello, Konstantin. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Konstantin. Hi, Caio.
Hello, Mike. Hello, Caio.
Thank you for joining us. So, are you an iOS developer?
Yes, I'm an iOS developer for the last 3 years.
Awesome. How can we help you?
I have some questions about using analytics and tracking events. The first question is it bad when all layers in my app depends on some analytics framework? And how can I track event which I sent when user press some button, and also sent as a parameter something that was received from interactor, and still using analytics only in composition root? I think this is the first question.
Okay, so analytics. Is it okay to have analytics frameworks everywhere in your application?
Yes.
Well, I don't like it, but if it works for you, if it's a small application, that's fine. The problem is that you end up either accessing this dependency like in some kind of global state, like some kind of singleton or some kind of global variable, or you need to inject it everywhere, and then you have constructor over injection. So ideally, I like to decouple my classes from analytics, because analytics is a cross-cutting concern, which means it's a concern that is spread around the code base. Like you want analytics in most features. So if you don't separate analytics from the features, you might start coupling the features one with the other because of the analytics frameworks as well. So analytics is one of those things, like logging as well. Analytics, logging, cross-cutting concerns that end up polluting the code base everywhere. It makes testing harder, makes managing dependencies harder, and then you just start resorting to singletons and global state. So what I like to do with cross-cutting concerns, what I learned throughout the years, is to use decorators for cross-cutting concerns. You know the decorator pattern?
Yes.
So this is one way of dealing with analytics and logging in the composition root. As you mentioned, composition root is a place where you can keep cross-cutting concerns. For example, let's write some code here. You have a view controller, and there's a function here, button tapped. Let's say you wanted to log when this button is tapped, right? And you can do something like analytics.
Yes, and this is event from view.
Yes.
View call button tapped.
Okay.
So here, the view controller needs to talk to this analytics instance somehow, either through some kind of shared instance or through some kind of dependency injection, like property injection. Analytics. It ends up adding more responsibility to the view controller, because the view controller now is not just managing the views, but also communicating with the analytics framework and sending messages to analytics framework. Instead, what I like to do is to emit events from my view controller. For example, you can have a view controller delegate. And you can have a method like button tapped. It's just saying, hey, this happened. This event was emitted. This button was tapped. Now, what happens is not up to the view controller. It just sends, hey, this button was tapped. What happens? Someone else is supposed to do something with it. And for example, you could have a coordinator that implements this delegate. And when the button is tapped, it will like present view B, present another view. right? And you also want to log, to track that event as well. And you have another class called analytics. Let's say analytics. Say analytics decorator.
Yeah, view controller decorator.
It also implements the same interface.
Yeah.
But when there's a button tapped, it talks to the analytics. Now, there are two behaviors you want to happen here. You want to, when the button is tapped, you want to navigate to VOB, for example, and you also want to track. So instead of doing both things in the view controller just tell the delegate that the button was tapped.
Yes, and I can use two delegates.
Yes.
That's good. And what should I do when I need not only track button tapped, but I need some information which I sent with this event? For example, I have two models which I load from somewhere else, and I should I should track button tapped with with two models.
Yeah, you can inject whatever behavior you need in this decorator or adapter, call it, it's about the same thing.
Yeah, for example, if to be able to track, you need to have access to some models, you can define here as a dependency, this model.
Yeah.
It can be let's, don't need to be vars, let's model. And here's a button tapped with model dot some property. Right? So if it is required to have this model to be able to perform this analytics event, you define it as a dependency.
Yeah.
And when you're creating this decorator, for example, you need to provide all the dependencies. And the compiler will enforce that you have all the dependencies at compile time. And the same thing, it's not just about events coming from the UI, but sometimes you want to log, let's say you have some kind of service that will load some data. And you want to track like how many items you loaded from the service. If the service has some kind of like completion block or a delegate like this as well, decorate it and inject the analytics behavior into the service. It's not just about UI interactions. Any abstraction that you can intercept, like here we're intercepting it with decorators, composites, any kind of abstract interface here, any kind of abstraction that you can implement different behavior, polymorphic behavior, you can intercept that call and inject analytics into it.
And can I combine this? For example, I have analytics view controller decorator, and it is delegate of UI view controller, and can it also be a decorator for a service?
Listen to both.
Yes, listen to both.
Yeah.
Can be. That's why I would probably call this then an adapter. Let's say it conforms, and it can have, like, for example, extensions, right? Analytics adapter. It has an access to the analytics, to the model for this button tapped. And let's say here you also have a button. Here's like service completed request method that will track something like this. Requests completed. Let's say here you get like I don't know, some models, an array of models. And you want to log the models count. And here you get, for example, a completion block in the service. And when you create the service, you can pass the models, the completion, as the analytics adapter, as the dependencies that it needs. And here is the adapter dot service completed request.
Yeah.
For example. So every time the service completes, you will send a message to the adapter here that will send a message to the analytics. This way, the service doesn't know about analytics. And the view controller doesn't know about analytics as well.
Yes, I think this is good.
Oops.
Everything is decoupled, yeah.
I removed the name. And since you have two implementations of the same protocol, you can create a composite as view controller delegate composite. It also implements this. And you start with an array of composites. So delegates, array of delegate. Every time you call like button tabs, for example, you will call delegates. But for each, and you call button tapped on each. This way you can compose when you're creating the view controller here. Let controller, view controller dot delegate equals the composite with the delegates, both the adapter that we already have here and what is the other one? The coordinator, for example. Every time there's an event now, this event is delegated to both adapter and coordinator. Even though the coordinator doesn't know about analytics and the analytics doesn't know about coordinators, they both receive the messages and they both do different things at the same time. And you keep everything decoupled. And all this composition here is done in the composition root. This way you keep the concerns separated.
And it's extremely testable as well. Everything is so testable.
And you can do the same with closures. If you don't want to use protocols, absolutely fine. If you want two things to happen here, just call two things here.
Yep.
For example, adapter 2 dot do something else. And if you are using something like Combine or RX Swift, you get all this behavior for free without having to create your own composites, without having to create your own adapters or decorators. For example, I have a code base here, and this is my composition root where I create the composition, for example, of an HTTP client, making a request to a URL and mapping it into image comments mapper. So we get a data back from the network and we map it into image comments and we present to the user comments. And if I want to log how many comments we loaded from the API, I do this in the composition root. I can use the handle events publisher. And here it's receive output. Here we get the comments. And here I can do logger.log comments count comments. Whoops, comments count. So I injected this behavior into the chain without changing the controller, without changing the view model, without changing the presenters, without changing coordinators or anything.
The mapper, yeah.
Yeah, it all happens in the composition root with those universal abstractions. But again, you don't need to use Combine. If you're not using Combine or RX Swift, you create your own composites.
Yeah, it's exactly the same idea, which is basically interception, right? Like we front run the requests.
Yes, that's. I think I should do it.
Yeah, give it a try. Absolutely.
Yeah, have you seen the Clean iOS Architecture series?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, we mentioned there are some techniques about analytics and how to decouple it with wrappers, kind of wrappers. Decorators are kind of wrappers, for example, adapters and so on. And that's the principle. And then you can decouple your application from analytics or logging or authentication, like all those cross-cutting concerns that can be done in composition root. Then your application is much simpler. All the concerns are separated, and you can test and develop them, deploy them in isolation.
It's ready. You can do.
Yes, because sometimes you want to reuse a view controller in another application, but you don't want to bring analytics with it. But if your view controller is talking directly with the analytics framework, you need to bring that baggage along with it.
Absolutely.
Yes. Also, if someone has another analytics,
Yes.
they maybe can't change. They should rewrite some code that they get.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So that's why it's important to separate, the layers as much as you can. If it's just a small application, maybe it's fine to keep everything coupled because a small application can easily be rewritten or so on. But if you're building like a medium to large application, that's, in my opinion, mandatory to start separating concerns and moving cross-cutting concerns to the composition root as much as you can.
Yes.
Make sense?
Okay. Yes. I think I get an answer.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Yes, I have another question. It is about a remote config. How to use it in composition root when I have some flag that not available on on a start, and it will load later. But
Okay.
I should assemble my app now.
So remote config, that there will be a flag decided at runtime at some point.
Yes.
Asynchronously. For example, for A/B testing, like any on a specific flag that we get from remote, we will either load feature A or B.
Yes, yes.
So again, let's say you load it from the network, but at some point you're going to store it in locally, right? So you don't need to perform that config all the time. One thing you can do is your app is kind of in a loading state until you get the remote config. If you fail to get the remote config, you have like a fallback implementation. Like,
yes,
it's one way you can do it. Thus, while you're in the loading state, you didn't compose your application yet. You can wait to compose your application lazily. It's not because you have a composition root that you have to create all the objects up front. You can delay and lazily load the composition as needed. So you can compose your app after you got the details from the network and after you stored it somehow in the app. Make sense?
Yes, okay.
So you can delay the composition as much as you can. And you can have some default behavior. Maybe the first time you load the app, you don't want the app, the user to wait like for 10 seconds for the remote config to load. No, maybe you have some default flags in there. The first time you open the app, it's going to load whatever is in the bundle loaded with the app.
And use cache in the next.
Yes, and then you download it, cache it. The second time they open the app, then you will compose the application with the new configuration. So the user never waits, but it really depends on how important this remote config is for the business. If the business says, no, this needs to be loaded before the user loads, no, that's fine. You let the user hang for a while. You set a timeout, maybe of 5 seconds, so you don't wait too much. And don't block the main thread, otherwise the OS will kill your app. But show a loading screen, like accept the request, and you only do the composition afterwards. Otherwise, you start with a default composition, and once you load it at runtime, you can also replace it and recompose the application at runtime. So you can either decide, you have many options actually. You can decide to make the user hang until you load the config, or you just show a default config, like flags, they're bundled in the app. And as soon as you load something from the web, you recompose the application and change the whole UI, like at runtime. It can be done. I've seen apps doing this. Or you load it, and the next time you open the app, a new fresh open of the app will recompose the app with the new remote config. Those are strategies you can use depending on the needs of the application.
Okay.
Does it answer your question?
Yes.
Awesome.
I think it easier than I thought.
It's easy when everything is decoupled, when you can compose everything so quick.
Yes.
Yes.
Any other question?
Yes. There are two another questions. First is about abstractions. I have layers in my app, and between layers, for example, domain and presentation, I have frameworks with abstractions, and these frameworks also contains some models. And is it okay when models in abstractions?
Right.
Okay, so let's say we have a module here or a framework that contains some, I don't know, domain. And you have another module just with abstractions.
Yes.
Which is another framework, package, or pod. Then you have some implementation of those abstractions, like infrastructure. Is something like this?
Yes, and domain depends on abstractions and infrastructure implementation. And yes.
Okay. And you're saying here in the abstractions you have some protocols and so on.
Yes, and also some models, concrete models.
Concrete.
Yeah.
Domain models?
Yes.
So you're asking, is it okay? Yes, it depends. It depends how you want to organize your application. Because ideally the models, domain models, should be in the domain here. But you have in the abstractions, they are DTOs, right? The data transfer objects. Because domain models should contain behavior. They shouldn't be anemic models. They should contain behavior, not just data. But when you are passing data through boundaries to the implementations, sometimes to protect the infrastructure from knowing about behavior in the domain and executing behavior in the domain, you don't pass domain models through the abstractions. You pass data models.
Representation of them.
data models here.
Data models is a dictionary, or it's some struct or class without behavior?
Yeah.
Structs? Yeah, it can be structs.
Yeah.
For example, you may have a user model that have some logic about, for example, you have name, but to change the name of this user, there are some rules. You can only change the name once per month. So you have something like last change the date. And to update the name, you need some rules like update name. Even make it constant so clients cannot do it. Update name. So those are domain models that contain some business rules towards like updating the data and enforcing variants you want in your domain. Here, you only update the name if last change is more than 3 days. You can only update your name every 3 days, for example. You update it, you put all this logic here. But you don't pass this user, ideally, through boundaries. So others cannot start exercising behavior, domain behavior from other modules. When you're passing a user data for an infrastructure implementation, like a database, like, hey, store this user, usually you create something like user DTO, user data, which contains only data, for example, whatever the database needs to store. Those DTOs, you can put them here with the abstractions.
Yeah. And just be careful. You mentioned, are these dictionaries? If they are dictionaries, they're very specific as how they are structured. And they also, you also get all the APIs of the dictionary, which, I don't know, it might work in some cases, but in some other cases, you probably don't want that. So it would be, like, as a rule of thumb, I would say better to create your own models there, your own DTOs as a struct, for example, exposing just the APIs that the infrastructure is going to use.
And with dictionary, it easy to break logic.
Yes.
For example,
Yes.
Some key was key 1, and now it's
key
two.
Missing.
Exactly.
You just pass an empty dictionary, right? Nothing stops you from passing an empty dictionary. It's going to compile just fine. I mean, you can guarantee that with tests, but then you need to write much more tests to, make sure you're passing the right data as well. And you can catch these at compile time with rich types.
Yes.
So that's it. But depending on the application, if you want to have the domain models here, maybe it's going to work for you. The recommendation on domain-driven design and clean architecture is not to pass your domain models through other layers. You pass data models only with the data.
Okay. I think that's all with this question.
Yeah, awesome.
Any other questions?
Yes, and the last one is about using generics and protocols. Because in Swift we can't use protocol with associated type as a concrete type. And in my app, I use base generic class, for example, for use case base with input parameter and output parameter. And it is easy to make a mistake which implementation I use. For example, I have a use case which search country by name, and name is string, and country is a country model. And I have another case which search country by code, and code also a string, and country also country model. And I can path case that searching by code to screen, which is expect that that it will search by names, and the code will compile, but it would not work.
Yes, absolutely. If we're using primitives like strings, integers, even arrays and dictionaries,
Yeah.
it's very easy to pass the wrong data into your APIs because it's going to compile just fine. For example, even simplifying without protocols and generic types, if you have a function like load, and then you pass a URL string, we usually have here the first thing, guard let URL equals URL string, else return, or fatal error, pass the wrong data. Why? Because this API is lying. You don't want a string. You want a very specific string. Otherwise, someone can call this as like load URL string, not a URL. Right? You can pass anything. It's too open. So it's better to define your APIs with better types. If you want a URL, you will define here a URL. You can never call this function with the wrong data now. Right? And it's the same thing here. If you want a country name, instead of a string, you can create a type. Country name. And this type can hold a string.
Value, yeah.
Or you can call like a country, for example, and you have name. Country name. Now you define your APIs like this. Function find, you pass by name, country name. Now you cannot pass a country code here, right?
Yes.
A mistake. The same thing, you can create a country code struct. And if there's anything to validate that this is a valid country code, for example, country code, the ISO standard say it's 2 characters. You can have like a failable initializer, for example. If there's any rule regarding what is a country code, it can be done here. For example, if name dot count is bigger than 2 or is different than 2, return nil, something like this. So you cannot create a country code with an invalid string like length, for example. Or you can perform any kind of validation here. It's usually done with like currency codes as well. And then if you have all the validations for a country code in the type country code, and you have an API requires by country code, you cannot call this API without a valid country code, because to create a country code, it needs to pass this validation. So when you define API like this, you know that whoever passed me a country code, I know this is a country code. I don't need to keep validating it all the time. Just like I don't need to keep validating this URL all the time as a string, because I know it's a URL. Now it's just a matter of making the request and see if it succeeds. So instead of using primitives, in such cases, it's probably better to create some rich models representing that concept of a name, of an ID, of a country code, and so on, instead of using primitives like UUIDs, integers, arrays.
Yeah, arrays, even arrays.
Yes, I think this is a decision.
Yeah.
So that's it. Use types, better types. Define better APIs to prevent clients from making mistakes.
Yeah, it's very easy.
Exactly. Have a type system here. You know, it's a very strongly typed language, use it. It's
Yes.
your friend.
If it was Objective-C, then you can pass anything ID.
Yeah.
Yes. If you don't have the type system helping you, what do? Write tests.
Yeah.
You have to write more tests, but can be done.
And using is kind of class or something like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I mean, if you're checking these things, if you have to check those, yeah. It's a classic problem with dynamic languages, right? Like you don't know what sort of type or pseudo type you're passing there. But here you don't have this problem.
Yes.
Yes.
Although Swift is quite dynamic as well. Do some magic at runtime.
True.
Does it answer your question?
Yes.
Awesome. Anything else?
No. I got what I wanted.
No, fantastic. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Konstantin. It was awesome.
Thank you too.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.